Iceland. Beautiful, rugged, adventurous, and expensive. Or is it? Now, definitely the most common question I've been asked since visiting Iceland is how expensive is it? And in all honesty, I actually don't think visiting Iceland is as expensive as you might think it is, or it certainly doesn't have to be. And we certainly spent less than we expected. There are definitely a few things you can do to make a trip to Iceland much more affordable. So here are my top tips for visiting and photographing Iceland on a budget. Now, these are definitely real budget travel tips for Iceland. So you probably are going to have to sacrifice a little bit of luxury in turn to save some money. But the first one is obviously to rent a campervan to drive around the Icelandic ring road. If you're doing the whole ring road or just the south coast, a campervan really is the way to go when visiting Iceland. We actually rented our campervan from a company called Cheap Campervans, and they promised to be 40% cheaper than any other campervan brand in Iceland. And they did actually hold up to that promise. It was by far the cheapest campervan I could find when I was looking, but of course it is pretty basic. With a more budget campervan, you are getting an older van, like I think the one we had was probably from about 2016, so about 8 years old when we rented it. And it is pretty basic. They actually call them just tents on wheels. In the back, you're just gonna have a basic bed to sleep in, and then you're gonna have a pull-out camp stove, some cooking equipment, as well as kind of a wash bowl and a few things to wash up with. So pretty basic. However, for us, that really didn't matter. We found that in Iceland, we were rarely in our van. We weren't spending any time hanging out in there, really just going back to sleep. There's so much to see and do in Iceland. You're either driving, hiking, or sightseeing, or sleeping. So realistically, you don't actually need that bigger van to hang out in, especially if you're visiting during summer. Maybe during winter you want something a little bit bigger and a little bit warmer. But don't rush to Cheap Campervan's website to book a campervan, because another tip in regards to renting a campervan is don't be afraid to price match. Most campervans or car rentals anywhere in the world will have a cancellation period. So you can normally cancel completely free of charge up to about 48 hours before your first date of rental. This means you can secure yourself a campervan knowing that you've got what you need for your trip, but constantly check prices and price match as it gets closer and closer to your trip. We managed to price match our campervan multiple times, even against themselves. As their price went lower, we contacted them and they reduced the price. And then eventually I actually found the campervan even cheaper on a third-party website called Northbound. I've included a link in the description below to those guys. It's a really great way to compare lots of different car rental companies in Iceland, and it's by far the best way to book, so make sure to check that out. And we found our campervan on there for 400 euros. So I contacted the campervan company directly and said, could you price match this new price? They said they weren't able to. So what I did is I rebooked with Northbound, and then I cancelled directly with them, and our campervan went from 1,000 euros down to 400 euros. So a saving of 600 euros, which for us in Canada was almost $1,000, which is an absolutely huge saving. Staying in a campervan also means you can camp wherever you go. And the campsites in Iceland are honestly pretty basic and a little expensive for what they are, but you are probably paying something like 4,000 to 5,000 Icelandic krona per night. So it's not terrible and a lot cheaper than a hotel would be. The advantage of that as well is a lot of these campsites are much closer to some of the sites that you're going to want to see. So for example, you can park up right at the base of Skogafoss and be there at sunrise with your camera first thing in the morning. Often the campsites don't really offer any facilities at all, and you might even have to pay extra to use the showers. But like I said, it's still a hell of a lot cheaper than an Airbnb or a hotel. So insurance packages can definitely add a lot of extra cost to a campervan or a car rental anywhere in the world, and Iceland is definitely no different. And with the really harsh weather in Iceland, you really do want to have some coverage. There are lots of added extras like windshield cover, volcanic ash cover, or even kind of wind damage that you're really going to want to get covered whilst you're in Iceland. Now, there are some ways you can get cheaper versions of this insurance outside of the campervan rental companies. One of those might very well be via your credit card. Depending on what credit card you have and what type of vehicle you rent, you might find that your credit card covers the insurance for that and you don't need to get it locally. There are also options to buy insurance through a third party, and this can often be much cheaper than doing it directly with the campervan or car rental company. However, what I would say is the campervan companies in Iceland often offer a lot of other things as part of their insurance package. So not only are you getting coverage, but you're also getting a few extra rentals like camp chairs, camp tables, and even a 5G Wi-Fi dongle. And that 5G Wi-Fi dongle could also save you a fair amount of money, and I'll come back to that in just a second. We decided to buy car insurance directly with the campervan company, partly because we'd saved so much money by price matching and got that cost way down. We had space in our budget to buy the full insurance, which just really gave us peace of mind throughout the whole trip. One advantage of also renting a smaller, cheaper van like we had is also that the insurance is cheaper. Because the car itself is worth less money, the daily price you have to pay to insure it is a fair amount less than having a bigger, newer van. So again, even more savings. And as for that 5G Wi-Fi dongle, like I mentioned, they are often part of those insurance packages, but you could rent them separately as well for about €5 a day. And from our research, that was actually the cheapest way for us both to have 5G Wi-Fi signal throughout our trip. It was cheaper than buying an eSIM or a SIM card. The great thing about those Wi-Fi dongles as well is that multiple people can hotspot off of that one 5G dongle. You charge it in your van all day, and you can even take it with you in your bag or in your pocket whilst you're out and about and still get phone signal for several phones all at once. Now, do you need a four-wheel drive car? A lot of people definitely think so when it comes to going to Iceland, and it certainly has its advantages, and it means you can travel down a lot of the kind of more backcountry roads or the F roads. However, I would suggest that most people probably don't need to pay the premium for a four-wheel drive car when visiting Iceland. The majority of people are going to stick pretty close to the ring road, and if they are straying off it, you're probably not going to go onto F roads, especially if you're not visiting at the height of summer where all those F roads are actually open. So we only had a two-wheel drive car for our whole trip in Iceland, and it was cheaper to do it that way. And we really don't think it hindered what we did in any way. The ring road itself is really well kept and really well paved, so a four-wheel drive isn't necessary if you are just sticking to the ring road. We also visited a place called Thakil, which was down a gravel road, but it wasn't an F road, so our car was still covered under its insurance to drive down this road. All I'd say is it is often great to have a bit of experience on driving down kind of bumpy gravel roads or driving in snow, because the weather can change at any moment. But we did not need a four-wheel drive at any point during our trip. The one time we visited further into Iceland and we did go down some really big F roads, we actually went via a four-wheel drive bus and paid someone else to drive. In all honesty, a lot of the F roads that you might want to drive down, or the more extreme F roads to get to the better locations, you're really going to need some kind of off-road experience. Even in a normal four-wheel drive vehicle, you're not actually often going to be able to drive down some of these roads. You're actually going to need a highly adapted four-wheel drive vehicle with a snorkel and some really large off-road tyres designed for fording big rivers. And again, if you don't have the experience driving down those roads like that, it's probably not really worth doing, especially on your first trip to Iceland when there is so much to see in areas that are more easily accessible. And like I said, if you're on a budget, a two-wheel drive campervan is going to be a lot cheaper. Obviously, if you're driving yourself, a big expense is going to be gas or petrol on your way around, or diesel. Our van was so small and did take diesel, it was really fuel efficient. So take that into account. If you are renting a larger campervan or a four-wheel drive, the chances are you're going to use more fuel, so you're going to have to budget that in on your drive around the island. I have included a link to a gas calculator in the description below, so do check that out if you want to calculate how much fuel you're going to use whilst driving around the ring road. My next tip is definitely to stock up on food and supplies whilst in Reykjavik before you head out onto your trip, and look out for the pig. The most affordable grocery store in Iceland is definitely Bonus, whose logo is a big pink pig. You'll see these flags kind of all over the place if you're in one of the biggest cities like Reykjavik. I definitely recommend going in there and stocking up as much as you can before you leave. However, there are other supermarkets that you can find along the way. For example, Vik along the south coast has a great supermarket with lots of selection. It's a fraction more expensive, but not terrible. And in all honesty, the supermarkets are not as expensive as you think they might be. If you're coming from Europe or from the UK over to Iceland, you probably will have a bit of a shock. Prices are definitely more expensive than Europe. However, if you're coming from North America like the US or Canada, you'll honestly probably walk into a Bonus and be pleasantly surprised that a lot of stuff is the same, if not cheaper than it would be here in Canada. We were certainly surprised and walking around the supermarket being like, Oh, well, that's cheaper. That's cheaper. There were so many things that were cheaper than it would have been back at home. And at one point we'd almost considered bringing over sort of dried foods like noodles and all that kind of stuff with us from Canada, thinking it would be really expensive in Iceland. And we're very glad we didn't, because we actually saved some money buying that stuff over in Iceland than over here in Canada. Now, I don't know if that necessarily speaks much for how expensive Iceland is, but more so maybe tells a story about how expensive food in Canada is. My third tip is definitely to take advantage of the free food you might find at a campervan pickup location. This is a great way to get hold of staples, especially things like salt and pepper, oil, pastas, dried food, jarred sauces. There can be loads of different options of food that have just been left by other travellers in their campervans when they've returned them, or they've kind of donated it to the campervan pickup. So don't buy those things in the supermarket, grab them from the campervan company for free, and then return them if you don't use them afterwards. Tip number 4 is another food related tip, and that tip is to eat a lot of hot dogs. Now, you've probably heard about Iceland and its hot dogs, and they do sell them pretty much everywhere. There are some famous locations in Reykjavik that sell them out of hot dog stands, but you can also buy them from pretty much any gas station. They're around 500 to 700 kronas a hot dog, and if you grab a couple of those, that's going to fill you up for lunch whilst on the road, and going to be by far the cheapest thing to eat. Now, there's probably a few of you watching there thinking, I don't want to be eating hot dogs, they're just full of random mystery meat. And that's definitely the case in North America. However, the ones in Iceland are actually made with locally sourced lamb and are actually pretty good. And you can often get them topped with some fried onion or some crispy onion. And they're pretty tasty. So for what would cost us 5 or 10 Canadian dollars for lunch in Iceland is a pretty good deal. My 5th tip is don't visit the Blue Lagoon or the Sky Lagoon. And that might be a bit controversial because I imagine that is on the bucket list for a lot of people who are visiting Iceland. But these places are really expensive. The Blue Lagoon can easily cost between 14,000 and 20,000 Icelandic kronas to visit, depending on the package that you choose. So for us, that's about 140 to maybe 200 Canadian dollars, which for me is a lot. They're pretty iconic and pretty famous and very popular, so you're going to be sharing those hot pools with a lot of other people as well. Iceland is of course known for its geothermal activity, so you're probably going to want to visit a hot pool at some point during your trip, but there are ones that are definitely more scenic, much quieter, much cheaper, or completely free, spread amongst Iceland. Personally, I think you're going to get a better experience and save some money by visiting a hot pool a little bit further off the beaten track. Top tip number 6 is to use your legs. Most things you'll want to see and do in Iceland are essentially free. I mean, the thing that makes Iceland famous is its rugged scenery. So all of these things are natural and don't cost any money to visit. There are so many places you can explore, especially if you're willing and able to walk. I wouldn't recommend paying for expensive bus tours or expensive walking tours. If you've got your own campervan or your own car, you can pretty much drive to any trailhead and then walk from there to see what you want to see. A little bit of research is going to save you an awful lot of money in regards to what you want to go and see. And isn't that really what Iceland's all about, is getting absorbed in the rugged scenery and the beautiful nature that it offers. Taking pictures and going for walks are completely free, so on a day-to-day basis you're really only paying for some fuel, your campervan costs, a campsite, and some food. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not actually that bad. But like I mentioned, there are a few links in the description below to help you with that campervan or car rental, or to help you calculate the cost of gas on your trip. If you can think of any more tips to help save money on a trip to Iceland, please do leave those in the comments below. But hopefully you found this video somewhat useful, and hopefully I will see you on the next one.